So this past week, I started a sermon series called The Right Side Up Life. It'll be a 22-week series into the Sermon on the Mount found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, in which Jesus details the life he's calling those who follow him to lead. And it's an important passage, not just because it's Jesus's direct sayings to the church about how to live, though that is the primary thing. It's an important passage in our state and in our culture, in our time and in our culture. Because we don't often have a way to kind of view what does it look like to live a certain way? What does it look like to live in light of the grace that Christ has offered? What is a picture of the flourishing life? We need better examples and better pictures of what it looks like to live. Not just what do we need to do, but more than that, who are we called to be? And what the Sermon on the Mount does, because it comes on the wake of Jesus' divine grace, we entrust that Christ is sufficient to lead us and save us. And because of the divine grace that he has offered us, we can live out the life that he calls us to live in the Sermon on the Mount. The mistake that we sometimes make in the Sermon on the Mount is that we look at them like a list of to-dos. Well, we have to make sure we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this, and then we do that. And then once we do all those things, maybe we'll get this Christian life done. But that's not what Jesus is calling us to. More so, Jesus is calling us not to just things to do or a list to complete, but rather he's calling us to a flourishing kind of life. He's not saying these are the things you have to do in order to be a Christian. He's saying, if you're a Christian, then you're called to live in this way. Meaning that the impact and the purpose and the means of the Sermon on the Mount is to talk about what kind of people we're called to be, not just what are the things that we're supposed to do. And that's a pretty distinct difference. We're not just called to scratch off items on a list. Jesus is calling us to be a certain kind of person in this world as we act and respond to his divine grace. He's not just calling us to do things differently. He's calling us to be different people. And the Sermon on the Mount is an image of the flourishing life, of what it means to be a different person in the world. No matter if the world is run by the Roman Empire in Jesus' time, the intersection between his Jewish culture and the Greco-Roman world, or our culture. It doesn't matter what culture we're in, Jesus calls us to be a different kind of person within the culture that we've been given and ushered into. And so Jesus is going to call us to be a different kind of person. And just for a moment, I want to define how it is he's calling us to do that in and through the Sermon on the Mount. I want to use a word that we don't use very often, but maybe we should use a little bit more, which is virtue. Virtue is a word that means something pretty deep and impactful, and actually is a direct line to the idea of being a certain kind of person rather than just doing activity. It works as we understand the Sermon on the Mount. And throughout the next 22 weeks, we're going to be looking at this idea of a virtuous life, or a flourishing life, or a whole and complete life, as we looked at the words blessed and perfect last week. And to understand a whole, complete life, to understand a life that's blessed or flourishing, as Jesus tells us, is to understand a virtuous life. So I just want to define the idea of virtue, and then over the next few weeks we'll talk more and more about that. But virtue is something that's important to the life of the believer, and it's important to understanding the Sermon on the Mount. So I'll define it, and then I'll tell you why it matters. I'm going to be using the definition of virtue through a book called After Virtue by a guy named Alistair McIntyre. He's a current writer. He's a modern writer. He comes from a Christian perspective, but speaks well into the culture. Virtues are characteristic qualities, things like humility, honesty, generosity, love. Those are virtue qualities that aren't just things that we do in the world. They're more expressions of who and what kind of people we are in the world. To live virtuously, to act virtuously, generously, humility, and so forth, is not just to tick things off a list. It's a way of being in the world that expresses the kind of person or the kind of people we are. So a Christian, because of the kind of people we are called to be through the Sermon on the Mount, are called to be virtuous people. We're not just called to act lovingly in the world or to do nice things in the world. We're called to be a people who express the love of God because we are virtuous, because we live a certain way, because we are influenced and moved in and through by the divine love of God by His Spirit. So we're called to be virtuous people. We're called to act with humility, act with love, act with generosity, act with truth, be honest, and so on. Not just because we want to do different activities in the world, but because this is the kind of thing that we're called to be. And so virtue is not just about doing things, it's about the kind of person we're called to be. So when Jesus comes and preaches the Sermon on the Mount to his initial hearers, but then to us as the church, we understand that he's not just giving a list of things to do. He's saying, this is the kind of person I'm calling you to be. And it looks like this. It's a picture of this. But really, it's not about doing things. It's about this is who you're called to be. When we enact virtue in our lives, when we live honestly, generously, lovingly, truthfully, all those things in the world, the thing about virtue is twofold. One, virtue has a meaning in the action itself. When I act generously, when I act lovingly, when I act humbly, when I do those things, there's meaning in me doing it. I have meaning in the action itself. But it also has meaning for the other person. So when someone acts virtuously in the world, expressing virtue in the world through the way that they are, the kind of person that they are, it benefits them, but it also benefits the other person. When virtue is expressed in the world, everybody benefits. The Sermon on the Mount is a picture of the life of virtuous living. So much so that when we live it out, everyone benefits. Everyone gets better through virtuous living. It doesn't mean that everything's perfect or everything's easy or this is not a shortcut. In fact, this is the opposite of a shortcut. This is the hard work of life, expressed through the grace of Jesus for the sake of others. The other thing that happens, not only is there meaning found in the person doing it, but then also is there meaning found for the other person who's receiving it. Because of that, virtue is always done in a community. So when we express generosity, humility, truth, and so on, we are doing so not just isolated and at home, but we're doing so in a community. It takes a community to live virtuously. So when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, why does it even matter that I create a video that defines virtue? Because when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is not saying do certain things. He's saying be a certain kind of person. Be a virtuous person. That when you enact, there's meaning in the way that you act. We all want meaning in the way that we act. In fact, Alistair McIntyre would say every act that we do is looking for some kind of good. And Jesus is saying when you act this way, when you live this out, when you're this kind of person, when you act, this is the kind of good you can expect. It's a benefit to you, it's a benefit to others. And it's not just about the benefit it creates, it is about the way that it expresses the goodness of God in the life of the world around us. So why does it matter? It matters because the Sermon on the Mount is not just a list of things, it's a picture of who we are called to be, and we are called to be a virtuous people in the world. To live in such a way that as we express the good in our own lives by acting humbly, lovingly, generously, truthfully, we also benefit the other person receiving it. And that's what it means to live out life in the Sermon on the Mount.